Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is U.S. State Renewables Portfolio and Clean Electricity Standards, Berkeley Lab's 2023 review. We have Galen Barbose with us from Berkeley Lab. We're very excited to have him here. And before I pass it over to him and to our moderator for our webinar content, I'll go over some quick logistics. All of our attendees are in listen-only mode. You can tune into the webinar via your telephone or your mic and speakers. If you'd like to minimize your webinar console, you can use the orange arrow that you see circled here. You can also use that orange arrow to expand your webinar console. One thing you might like to do with that webinar console is to submit your questions and your comments. We will be saving about 15 minutes at the end of our presentation for a Q&A with the audience, and we will get to as many questions as we can, so please do type those questions in when you think of them. A final note, this webinar is being recorded. We will send you an email with a copy of the webinar recording and a PDF of the slides. So with that, I will now pass it over to my colleague, Anna Ziai, and she will tell us more about CISA and about our webinar today.
Thank you, Sam. Hi, everyone. My name is Anna Ziai, and I'm the Project Director for State Implementation of IRA and BIL at CISA. CISA is a national nonprofit coalition of public agencies and organizations working together to advance clean energy. We work with state leaders, federal agencies, industry representatives, and other stakeholders to develop clean energy programs and inclusive renewable energy markets. CISA members, who are mostly state agencies, include many of the most innovative, successful, and influential public funders of clean energy initiatives across the country. And you can see our members' logo in a moment on your screen right here. So we are a part of the 100% Clean Energy Collaborative, which assists states and other entities that have 100% clean energy goals or are considering adopting such a goal by providing knowledge sharing activities and analysis so that they can address program challenges and opportunities. The collaborative is managed by CISA in partnership with the U.S. Climate Alliance, and it's been researching a number of state clean energy issues and has come out with several helpful reports on topics such as state legislation, plans, and reports on the clean energy transition, tables, timelines, and maps of clean energy states, and many other resources. And you can find all these resources at cisa.org/100. Today, we're going to be discussing Berkeley Lab's recently released 2023 edition of U.S. State Renewables Portfolio and Clean Energy Standards. This is a reoccurring report, and it provides an overview and status update on renewables portfolio standards, RPSs, and has been expanded to also cover 100% clean electricity standards, CESs, adopted by a growing number of states. The report, which was published in slide deck form along with accompanying data files, describes recent legislative revisions, key policy design features, compliance with interim targets, past and projected impacts on renewables development, and compliance costs. We're lucky enough to be joined today by Berkeley Lab's Galen Barbose, who will present key findings from the report. Galen is a research scientist in the Electricity Markets and Policy Department at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. Barbose conducts research and analysis on issues in the electricity industry related to renewable energy, energy efficiency, and electric systems planning. Among other activities, he leads Berkeley Lab's annual Tracking the Sun Report series and the annual Renewable Portfolio Standard Status Report, and manages a variety of projects analyzing regulatory and policy issues associated with the growth of distributed solar. Since joining Berkeley Lab in 2001, Barbose has authored more than 100 publications and has presented his work on hundreds of occasions in a wide range of forums. Prior to Berkeley Lab, he was a project engineer at Nexen and Schiller Associates, providing project management, engineering, and consulting services for utility-funded energy efficiency and other demand-side management programs. He holds a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering and philosophy from UC Berkeley and UC Santa Cruz, respectively, and a master's degree from the Energy and Resources Group at UC Berkeley. All right, without further ado, I will turn it over to Galen. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Sana, and thanks, Sam, and thanks to all of you for joining here today. Really happy to be here. I'm excited to be able to share this latest edition of our annual RPS and CES status report. So hopefully you can all see my screen here. So before just launching into the material, I wanted to draw all of your attention to the web address at the bottom of the title slide here, rps.lbl.gov. That's the website where you can find a copy of the report. I should mention the report is essentially a larger version of the PowerPoint deck that I'll be presenting here, but certainly it has material that I won't be able to cover in the course of today's webinar. And then in addition, and as Anna mentioned, we also published some accompanying data files that contain some of the underlying data that we'll be presenting in the report here today. So a lot more information available for you at that website there. So with that, let's get started. So first, just to kind of give a sense of the scope of this report, kind of what's in and what's out. We're obviously covering RPS programs. RPSs are binding requirements placed on retail electricity suppliers to provide some minimum percentage of their load with eligible sources of renewable electricity. I imagine many of you are well acquainted with RPSs. They've been around for a long time. This year, as Anna mentioned, we also added to the report coverage of clean electricity standards, or CESs, and those are really analogous to an RPS, but are just target a broader range of eligible technologies. One practical distinction that we make for the purpose of this report is that many of the CES policies that we'll be talking about may or may not have kind of a defined enforcement mechanism in the way that RPSs do. And to some extent, that just reflects the kind of nascent state of these CES policies. Over time, that may change. But for the purpose of this report, rather than trying to kind of draw a fine line, we just decided to include anything that really kind of resembles this broad definition of a CES. We also included within that definition what in other cases might be called an electric sector emission standard. And so those differ from kind of the typical CES in that the target is specified as some percentage reduction in electric sector emissions relative to a baseline, ultimately getting down to 0%. So we include those as CESs here. We have excluded a few things from this report, namely any economy-wide carbon reduction targets that lack some electric sector specific standard. There are a few of those. We also excluded any targets that have been voluntarily adopted either by utilities or individual corporations, as well as targets, state targets that have been established only through an executive order without some corresponding piece of legislation. And then lastly, we haven't included Puerto Rico or any other US territories in the report here, though some of them do have RPSs or CESs. So with that bit of background, let's first just kind of talk a little bit about kind of where these policies exist and what they look like. So the map here shows the 29 states plus the District of Columbia that currently have some sort of binding RPS policy. Collectively, those 30 jurisdictions cover over half of all retail electricity sold in the US. And the shading on the map here gives you some sense for the variation in the target levels within each of those RPSs. About half of the RPS states have targets of at least 50% of retail sales or more. And there are 3 states, Rhode Island, DC, and Hawaii, that have 100% RPSs. In addition, there are then 15 states that have established some broader 100% CES. Those are shown here. And as you can see, in almost all cases, those CESs have been adopted by states that also have an RPS. And so in some sense, the RPS in those states has now been subsumed within the CES and kind of constitutes one of the key pieces or elements of that broader clean electricity standard. Here we just give a sense for the timeline over which these policies have been adopted and revised. On top of the timeline here, you can see in each year the states that enacted an RPS. By and large, those policies have been around for a long time, at least a decade, some cases 2 decades or more. The CES policies, as you can see on the upper right, are much more recent. In all but a few cases, those have been enacted just within the past 5 years. And then below the timeline, we show in each year the states that made some sort of major revision to their RPS or CES. And that just gives some sense of the scale over which these policies have evolved over time. In terms of recent legislative changes within the past year and a half, there have been about 150 bills, RPS-related bills, introduced across the states. A small fraction of those, only 17%, actually were enacted. You can see kind of a summary of those bills in the table on the upper left-hand side, sorted into whether they sought to strengthen or weaken the policy, or in many cases, just make kind of some neutral kind of technical change. Of the pieces of legislation that were enacted, 4 of them strengthened the RPS. 3 of those, Connecticut, Minnesota, and Rhode Island, consisted of either new 100% CES policies, or in the case of Rhode Island, raising their RPS to 100%. The 4th, Hawaii, made what might on first glance seem to be a rather esoteric technical change to the way that their RPS target is calculated, but that technical change effectively entails a pretty significant increase in their ultimate target level. So with that bit of background, I want to now talk kind of historically about what impacts RPSs and more recently CESs have had on renewable energy development in the US. And just as a preface to that discussion, I think it's important to stress that there are a whole variety of different market and policy factors that are driving renewable energy growth. I mean, you've got, of course, RPS programs and CES programs, but in addition, you have federal tax credits, you have the declining cost of renewable energy technologies, you have voluntary power markets, other kinds of state and federal policies. So a whole assortment of different drivers that are all contributing to the growth that we've seen over the past few decades. And it can be challenging, if not really impossible, to try to kind of isolate the impact of RPS programs alone. And so we haven't tried to do that here. Really what I'm going to do is just provide some numbers that help to provide some rough sense, kind of order of magnitude understanding of what impacts these policies have had. So the first thing that we can do is just compare actual growth in non-hydro renewable electricity, that's the red line in the figure here, to the minimum amount of growth that needed to happen simply to meet RPS targets over the past couple decades. And comparing those 2 lines, you can see that just under half of the growth in renewables is what was needed simply for RPS compliance. Now, that blue line, certainly some of that growth would have happened even in the absence of RPS programs. But by the same token, those RPS programs, by providing this kind of stable source of demand and helping to grow the renewable energy industry in the US, have helped cultivate the conditions under which renewables have been able to flourish even outside of RPS programs. And so this, again, just kind of gets to the challenge of attribution. But nevertheless, the lines here provide some rough sense of scale. Now, these are national numbers. When we look at the same data on a regional level, here, sort of a more nuanced story emerges. And so we're presenting the same information, comparing actual growth in renewable generation in red to the minimum amount of growth needed just to meet RPS targets, the blue lines. And we break that out into the 6 different regions shown here. And you can see, focusing first on the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic regions on the left-hand side, that the actual growth in renewables was less than the minimum needed. And we'll talk later about kind of compliance experiences with RPS programs. But suffice to say, at least in those 2 regions, it's pretty clear that RPSs have been a key driver for renewable growth. You contrast that with, say, Texas and the Midwest, where actual growth in renewables has far outstripped the minimum needed for RPS programs. It may be that the RPSs were critical in kind of the early years of renewable development in those regions, but certainly at this point in time, renewable growth in those parts of the country is really happening largely independent of any RPS targets. Another way that we can get some sense of scale here is by looking at new capacity additions each year, renewable capacity additions, and who's purchasing the power from those projects and whether they're using that renewable energy for RPS compliance or not. And the first step in this process is just determining who's purchasing the power from each new project built each year. And that's what we've shown here. This is just an intermediary step, but is kind of interesting in its own right. And so I thought I would share it. And so what you can see here is we've split up off-takers into the 4 different groups here. The first group in dark blue are utilities and power marketers. And those are historically and still currently the largest class of off-takers for new renewable energy projects. But you can see that their share has definitely diminished in recent years. In light blue are the retail off-takers. So these are corporate PPAs and community solar projects. And you can see how those have become much more prominent in recent years, though their share did drop off a little bit last year. Then in light blue are the on-site projects, so kind of behind-the-meter projects. Those, that's been around for a while, but their share has grown. And last year actually expanded quite a bit, so much so that on-site projects were the second largest class of off-takers. And then finally, you've got that small bit of dark green at the top, which are merchant projects. So now within each of those 4 off-taker buckets, some of the renewable capacity is being used for RPS purposes and some of it is not. And so when we go through that whole bean counting exercise, we get to the chart shown here, where we've just bucketed the capacity additions each year into the RPS and non-RPS portions. And then the red line shows the RPS percentage of the total. And if you look at that red line, you can see that the RPS share of new renewable capacity additions has been declining over time. 10 years ago, it was 60% or so of new capacity additions were being used for RPS compliance. That share has now dropped off to about a third, or 30% or so. And that drop off hasn't happened because RPS new builds have shrunk in any absolute sense. In fact, they've actually grown. It's just that capacity additions outside of RPS requirements have grown even faster. And what exactly are those non-RPS capacity additions? The biggest chunk last year consisted of utilities and power marketers who are outside of RPS states or have already met their RPS compliance obligations and are still purchasing renewable energy simply due to the economics of renewables. So about 7 gigawatts of that was built last year. On-site behind-the-meter solar was the next biggest chunk of non-RPS capacity builds last year. A big part of that was in California, where behind-the-meter solar largely is not being used for RPS compliance, as well as in Florida and Texas. And then last, you've got quite a significant amount of corporate PPA and community solar capacity that is not certified for RPS eligibility. And that last kind of bit of the phrase is important. There certainly was more than 5 gigawatts of community PPA and community solar capacity built last year, but a lot of that capacity is likely making its way into RPS markets. In other words, the RECs from those projects are ultimately being used for RPS compliance. And that's an important point. I think often people think about corporate PPAs in particular as being something different from RPSs and as kind of a separate source of demand. But in fact, there is a significant amount of overlap. So we'll now kind of turn our attention from the past to the future and look at kind of what impacts we might expect RPS and CES programs to have going forward in terms of new RPS, new renewable capacity additions and supply growth. So first, before doing that, I just want to give kind of a sense of the targets and timelines that we're talking about here. So the figure here, it shows for each state the final RPS and CES target in percentage terms. That's along the y-axis, and for each the final target year, so the year in which that maximum target needs to be reached. And so focusing first just on the RPS states, the blue circles, we can segment those into basically 3 different groups. First, in the lower left-hand quadrant, you've got that contingent of kind of legacy RPS programs with fairly low targets, typically in the kind of 15 to 25% range, and with final target years that either have already passed or that will be reached within the next few years. Then in the middle of the chart, you've got a pretty sizable set of RPS states with much higher targets, typically in the 50% or higher range, with target years in or around 2030. And then finally, you've got a smattering of RPS states further out to the right, which have similarly aggressive targets, but longer time frames. Now, most of the states in those latter 2 groups with relatively high RPS targets have also adopted even higher and longer term CES targets. Those are the yellow circles shown here. And those CES targets typically have target years in the kind of 2040 to 2050 range. The figure here dives a little bit deeper into the CES timeframes because this is an important thing to understand for some of the later figures. And so the figure here is a little bit difficult to immediately grasp, but basically what we're showing for each of the states with the CES policy, the years over which those CES targets are in force, I should say. And so the first thing to note is that for most CES states, the initial target years are somewhat delayed. Typically, they don't commence until at least 2030, if not later, and often some years after the final RPS target year. Also, unlike RPS programs, which generally ramp up fairly steadily from year to year, CES targets don't usually have such a defined ramp-up period. Usually instead, they either will consist of just some single distant year target out in 2040 or 2050, or else they might have some single start year target and then a final year target, but without any defined ramp-up over the intervening period. And so with that information, we can now go to the slide here, which shows our projection of RPS and CES requirements over time. So this is kind of the total amount of renewable energy or renewable energy certificates that will be needed in any given year in order to meet CES and RPS targets. And you can see how that quantity is growing over time. Focusing on the RPS portion, you can see pretty steady growth, though in 2030, there's a little bit of a kink downward where most states hit that final target year by 2030. The CES programs then pick up that slack, though the growth in the CES demand, as you can see, is pretty has this lumpy shape to it, and that just reflects the kind of staged and staggered nature of the CES targets that we were looking at on the last slide. Now, that last figure was just showing total demand. Here we're looking at really kind of how much of that demand might be met with existing resources versus how much kind of new supply is actually needed to meet that demand growth. And focusing first on the RPS portions, you can see that really basically all of the growth in RPS demand is going to require new renewable supplies. On the CES side, even though those targets don't kick in until 2030 or later in most states, you can see that about half of the CES demand could be met with existing resources, and most of those existing resources consist of existing nuclear and or large hydro facilities that aren't eligible under states' RPS targets. And so that's just an important kind of factor to keep in mind when thinking about the potential incremental impact of this recent spate of 100% CES targets. Now, there are a couple important factors that we haven't accounted for here. The first is retirements. So, we're looking at existing resources as of the end of 2022. Certainly, some of those projects are going to retire over the 25-year time span that we're looking at here. And so some addition of new resources will be needed just to replace those retiring existing facilities. And that includes any failure to relicense existing hydro or nuclear. And so that factor on itself would tend to increase the new resource needs. Conversely, what might reduce new resource needs is new interregional transmission that would allow existing resources that are currently locked out of RPS markets to access those markets. And I'm thinking particularly about interregional transmission between the Midwest and the Eastern Seaboard and Mid-Atlantic regions, where there's a lot of RPS demand and there's a lot of existing renewable capacity in the Midwest that currently isn't able to access those markets. Focusing here just on the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic, we can see how a pretty significant portion of the new supply needs might be met simply through the offshore wind targets and, to a lesser extent, solar and DG carve-outs that have been adopted in those states. And so the two figures here show in the top line in each figure the total new supply needs under the RPS and CESs. And then within that, we show what portion might be met by both offshore wind targets as well as the solar and DG carve-outs. And you can see that the offshore wind targets in particular, those those are some significant resources, and you can get a sense for just how the pace and success of offshore wind development could really kind of swing the balance in terms of how much new resources are needed to meet RPS demand in those regions, as well as kind of what might happen with REC pricing as those large offshore wind projects come online. So lastly, in this section, I wanted to just give some larger context and compare renewable growth under RPSs and CESs to total amount of growth in new renewables that EIA has projected within its latest annual energy outlook. And so the heavy dash line at the bottom shows just basically the minimum growth in non-hydro renewable generation that would need to happen simply to meet RPS and CES targets out to 2050. And so those policies just alone would require non-hydro renewables to grow from about 17% of generation today to 28% by 2050. In contrast, EIA projects non-hydro renewables to grow to 57% of total U.S. generation by 2050, with a lot of that happening over the course of the next decade, due in no small part to the tax credits now extended under Inflation Reduction Act. And so altogether, you look at these numbers, and the RPS and CES related growth represents about a quarter of the total growth in non-hydro renewables projected out to 2050. But obviously, there's a lot of uncertainty around what might actually happen, as indicated by the shaded band. And so there are certainly scenarios where these RPS and CES programs could be more significant on a relative basis and could serve kind of really an important backstop role, given some of the larger market and policy uncertainties. So real quickly, I want to now just run through kind of the compliance data and talk a little bit about how successful states have been in actually meeting their RPS targets to date. So the first figure here looks at compliance data for the most recent compliance year in each state, typically 2021 or 2022. The bars, the total height of the bars show the RPS target in those years, and then we show for each state what fraction, if any, of that target was short. What was the REC shortfall in that year? And so certainly in the northeastern and mid-Atlantic states, what we're really talking about is what fraction of the target was met with alternative compliance payments. And so you can see, just looking across the full set of states, in general, states have been successful in meeting their targets. There have been a few small exceptions here or there, generally reflecting kind of just idiosyncrasies within individual states. In Illinois, there was a larger shortfall, and that just reflects some of the transitional issues associated with the rather significant change to its RPS in 2021. Many states, though, are ahead of schedule, and you don't necessarily get a sense for that here. But what that effectively means is that in many states, they are accumulating banked RECs that then can be used for compliance in future years. Here we look at kind of the same sort of data, but focusing just on solar and DG carve-outs within the set of states that have those policies within their RPSs. And again, you can see most states have met those carve-outs pretty well, though there are some exceptions here and there. Again, largely reflecting kind of state-specific issues rather than anything especially systematic. I would note in Maryland in 2021, they fell short of their solar carve-out, but legislation then reduced the carve-out in the following year. And so that's just kind of one example of how legislation can sometimes be responsive to compliance experiences. So the last section here, I want to talk about REC pricing and compliance costs, RPS compliance costs. So focusing first on REC prices. So REC prices are significant from a couple of different perspectives. From kind of the developer perspective, REC prices are important because they are a key source of revenue. And so they signal to the market whether new projects will be profitable, whether new projects are profitable, and kind of what the supply-demand balance looks like in any given state or market. From the consumer side, of course, REC prices are important because they are one of the key determinants of compliance costs. So whereas developers might like high REC prices, customers often don't, and regulators are of course caught in the middle. Here, though, we're just looking at REC prices for New England and Mid-Atlantic. I don't want to spend a lot of time here. Mostly, I just want to give some sense of kind of what's happened in recent years. In New England, you can see that REC prices have been pretty stable over the past few years, hovering in that kind of $40 per megawatt hour range, which is just below the ACP in Massachusetts and Connecticut. And so that signals that New England is, not sort of totally undersupplied, but there is a kind of a tight supply-demand balance. In the Mid-Atlantic, the pricing there is a little bit more varied from state to state, but within the higher priced states of New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Delaware, those prices have been steadily rising over the past 4 years. They ended last year at $30 per megawatt hour, which is effectively an all-time high. And that increasing REC price, those increasing REC prices reflects just the tightening supplies in those regions, which in turn is in no small part due to interconnection delays and issues with getting new projects built. And as a result, new build within the region is not keeping pace with growing RPS demand. And so as a result, we can see this trend in REC pricing. Here we look at REC price trends just for solar renewable energy certificates. And the main thing I just want to draw your attention to here is that there are a few states, DC, Massachusetts, and New Jersey, which have relatively high REC prices, SREC prices in the $200 to $400 per megawatt hour range. And that is significant when we start looking at compliance costs in the next slide. So here we're focusing now on compliance costs. And we have denominated the compliance costs as a percentage of average retail electricity bills. So that's what's shown on the y-axis here. And you can think about this as being kind of roughly equivalent to the rate impact. It's not exactly the same, but it kind of gives you kind of a similar metric. And you can see that these compliance costs have varied quite a bit from state to state. On average, they were about 3.5% of customer electricity bills, but you can see clearly there are a number of states where those compliance costs were much higher. And in particular, DC, New Jersey, and Massachusetts had the highest compliance costs, And in those 3 states, you can see that those high compliance costs were largely driven by their solar and DG carve out, which in turn really is driven by those high SREC prices that we were looking at on the last slide. Beyond that, there's still quite a bit of variability from state to state, reflecting all sorts of different factors related to policy design and just the economics of renewables within each region. One important factor, though, is the procurement model and whether load-serving entities within a given state are relying primarily on unbundled renewable energy certificates, whose price can be somewhat volatile, or are instead relying primarily on bundled long-term power purchase agreements. And that distinction mostly comes into play when you're looking at the retail choice states on the left versus the vertically integrated states on the right-hand side, where those bundled PPAs are kind of the primary compliance mode, and where you can see that in general, compliance costs tend to be a bit lower. And then the last results slide that I'll share here show compliance cost trends over time. And you can see, in some states, compliance costs over the past 3 years have been rising, and others they've been holding steady or even declining. All else being equal, rising RPS targets would tend to lead to increasing compliance costs. But that hasn't happened in some states for a variety of reasons. In part, it may be that utilities are able to procure lower cost renewables in more recent years, helping to kind of offset the increasing targets. In addition, within the past few years, retail electricity prices and retail electricity bills have also risen quite significantly as a result of kind of broader inflationary issues. And so when we're looking at compliance costs as a percentage of customer bills, in part, the denominator there is rising in some cases faster than the numerator. And so that is helping to suppress the compliance costs on a percentage basis, though it may not be helping to suppress those compliance costs if we were to instead look at them in some sort of absolute sense. So that's just an important kind of caveat to note there. So with that, I'll just kind of wrap things up with kind of some higher level signposts in terms of what impact and role these policies might have on a going forward basis. So first and foremost, their impact is going to depend on whether additional states decide to increase or extend their RPS targets or adopt broader 100% clean electricity standards. Certainly that has been the trend within the past 5 years, but it's unclear how many more states might potentially enter that fold. But that will be one key signpost to look out for. Another, as I mentioned, with many of these recently adopted CES policies, they don't yet have kind of clear implementation and enforcement mechanisms. And so the ultimate role and impact of those policies will very much depend on some of those kind of administrative details and how they get worked out. There have also been, as I'm sure all of you are aware, some very important federal policy developments within the past few years, namely the Inflation Reduction Act and bipartisan infrastructure law. Those will have far-reaching impacts on the growth of renewable and other clean electricity generation, as well as transmission. And those the impacts of those federal policies will then certainly have some important knock-on effects in terms of how well states are able to achieve their individual targets. There are also all sorts of other complementary efforts underway to address issues related to renewable integration and permitting, transmission and interconnection issues. Those impact clean electricity development more broadly, but certainly those are critical to helping states achieve their individual goals as well. Within the context of individual state policies, there are all sorts of seemingly esoteric, but also really important implementation details. I've mentioned a few here: long-term contracting programs, ACP rates, the rules related to banking excess renewable electricity credits, and so forth. those within any individual state can have really important impacts in terms of how much new renewable growth those targets ultimately require. And then last but not least, what's going to happen to renewable energy costs? There are mature technologies in solar and wind. There are other emerging technologies that are just coming into play, and sort of what happens to those technologies and their costs will be really important as states progress from kind of current target levels to ever more aggressive targets in the decades to come. So with that, I will end the formal presentation. I imagine we've got some good questions waiting in the wings, so I'll hand the mic back to Anna, who I imagine has been collecting those in the background. I look forward to answering your questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Galen. That was such an informative presentation, and thank you for your work on this report. I'm just seeing in the comments how helpful it's been for the audience members here. Before we dive into the Q&A portion, I just wanted to reiterate for anyone who may have missed it, that these slides aren't going to be posted. They are not going to be posted, mostly because the report itself is in slide-based form, and so you can actually access the report in the chat. We posted it in the chat, the link, so you can see basically these slides and others that have just been condensed for the purposes of this presentation. All right, so our first question from the audience is retention/retirement of RECs used to demonstrate RPS compliance universally? And tangentially, are there any states with RPSs that don't require retirement of RECs to demonstrate that they've met the target?
That's a good question. I would say, as far as I'm aware, retirement of RECs is a universal element, at least within RPS programs. But if there's anybody out there that's aware of an exception, please chat it in. Certainly, though, that is kind of the most common, if not the universal approach.
Great. And do you happen to have the data sets for what the RPS and CES for each state is, including which technologies are available and what the carve-outs are, and would other organizations be able to access that data?
Yeah, so we have some of that available. So among the different spreadsheets that we've posted, and again, that website is rps.lbl.gov. So there we've got a couple spreadsheets posted. One of them is a spreadsheet that has the percentage targets by state and year, and broken out by carve out as well. So we have that information available in tabular form. We don't have information assembled on technology eligibility, but for that, I would just direct folks towards the Desire website. They've got great information on individual state RPS programs, including kind of tabular summaries of eligible technologies.
Great. Does non-hydro renewable energy include nuclear when accounting for CES? Some states have started including nuclear fusion as RPS eligible projects. So for example, North Carolina.
So I guess I would just be clear about the difference between RPSs and CESs. So within RPS programs, I am not aware of any state that allows nuclear to qualify under their RPS. Now, there are certainly states that allow nuclear to qualify under their CES, and North Carolina may be one of them. And so when I refer to non-hydro renewables, I am excluding nuclear. I'm really referring to kind of solar, wind, certain forms of biomass, and geothermal, and yeah, those four fuel types.
Great. Another audience member wonders whether the compliance cost is shown as a percentage of energy cost rather than energy and delivery combined.
It is shown as a percentage of energy and delivery combined. So total, essentially, the denominator is the sum total of customers' retail electricity bills, is including both the any unbundled components.
Great. And then concerning the two figures that you offered about compliance costs, are these the costs that are fully passed on to consumers? Are utilities shouldering any of these costs?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, and was part of sort of why I made the caveat that those compliance costs aren't strictly speaking retail rate impact. So I'll talk about sort of retail choice states and then kind of vertically integrated states separately. In retail choice states, the compliance costs that we're focused on or that we compute are really the sum total of RECs and alternative compliance payments. And in some states, alternative compliance payments are not allowed to be passed through to retail electricity customers. Now, I think it's probably safe to say that there's really no way to prevent competitive retail suppliers from doing that. But in terms of default suppliers, at least in those states, the ACP component of compliance costs might not be getting fully passed through. So that's one instance where those compliance costs may not ultimately be passed through to retail customers. Now, in vertically integrated states, figuring out compliance costs is quite a bit more complicated because it basically requires taking the sum total, kind of the gross costs of procuring renewables for the RPS, and then deducting from that the avoided costs of whatever resources you are displacing. And so there's more of kind of a hypothetical counterfactual that comes into play. We don't do that analysis ourselves. We really rely on the utilities and state PUCs who do those calculations, and we just kind of roll up their numbers. But in general, utilities, the costs that they bear as a general matter don't necessarily get passed through on a one-for-one basis to retail electricity customers. I mean, that kind of depends on the dynamics of rate cases. Some costs are passed through directly through like fuel cost adjustment clauses, but other costs, may or may not be passed through, and it may be difficult to kind of observe directly how they get passed through.
Thank you, that's helpful. Another participant didn't catch if solar/DG carve-outs are focused on DG specifically or all solar, both DG and utility scale. So can you clarify that, and more generally speaking, speak to the impact of RPS compliance where states don't include DG in their RPS portfolio, so for example in California?
Okay, I'll try to cover all of those. So there are, I'm not sure exactly, actually I can back up. I don't know if Sam, if I'm still sharing.
You're not. Let me give you a slide.
Okay, well, or you can go to slide 24, Sam. So on slide 24, we show the states that have solar or DG carve-outs. And there are about maybe 15 or so shown there. And so in these cases, the DG, we haven't sort of specified in the chart which of these are solar versus which are DG. In states that have solar carve-outs, they are not specific to DG, so they may also include utility scale. There are some of these states, Arizona, Colorado, Illinois, some others where they are DG specific carve-outs. So unfortunately, it's impossible to tell from this slide which of the states have DG specific carve-outs versus broader solar carve-outs. We've just kind of embedded them both in here, but certainly I can provide that information if folks are interested. And then I think Anna, the second question was what impact has, actually, can you repeat the second question? Because I'm not sure I remember it correctly.
Yeah. Generally speaking, can you speak to the impact of RPS compliance where states don't include DG in their RPS portfolio?
So I would say, I mean, if we're looking at the compliance numbers on the previous slide, Sam, number 23, in general, the presence of a solar or DG carve-out doesn't have a significant impact on overall compliance levels, largely because usually these solar and DG carve-outs are pretty small in terms of the percentage target level relative to the overall RPS target. So, you might have a, say a 30% RPS target with a, 2 or 3% solar or DG carve out. And so whether or not that solar or DG carve out is met doesn't necessarily have a huge impact on overall compliance levels, but it may have a big impact on compliance costs, as we saw on some of the later slides.
Great. Are there any indications that a state CES program plans to supersede its RPS program?
No, I don't think so. I mean, as it sort of currently stands, the CESs are really separate policies from the RPSs. Though I think in some states, they view their RPS as being one element in the broader CES. But by and large, the CESs are sort of this parallel structure. I think RPSs are a known quantity, and I haven't really seen any indication that states are looking to kind of get rid of their RPS and simply replace it with the CES. We have, though, I think, seen some states that had kind of relatively modest RPSs, rather than kind of doubling down on their RPS, they instead enacted an aggressive CES. So Washington is a prime example of that. Washington has, a 15% RPS, which, by most standards is a relatively modest RPS target level. But they, rather than enacting a more stringent RPS, they instead enacted an 100% CES. So that, I think, is probably the more likely scenario than kind of getting rid of an existing RPS program.
Thank you. Are RPSs and CESs generally addressing energy consumption in a state, and specifically like generation in a state and imported from the grid? And also, are there mechanisms to enforce specific in-state generation targets?
Yeah, in general, no. I mean, certainly RPSs are focused on retail electricity that's sold within the state, irrespective of where the generation that is serving those retail customers come from. And part of that just has to do with kind of the practical challenges of mandating the kind of in-state generation sources, particularly in regions that are interconnected, where retail electricity customers in a given state might be receiving generation supplies from across the region. In the early days of the RPSs, I think some of the programs did try to focus the RPSs on in-state generation. A number of states ran into some issues with the kind of Commerce Clause and kind of the legality of requiring in-state generation supplies. And so those provisions were ultimately weakened or removed where they existed before. For the CES policies, I think it's a little bit more of a mixed bag. Some of them are focused on kind of targets that are denominated in terms of in-state retail electricity sales, but others do have language and target kind of target structures that are more geared towards generation. I think for in a number of states where the CESs are applied only to specific utilities, for example, in Oregon and in North Carolina and Virginia, I do believe that the CES targets for those states, they are really focused on the generation supplies of the individual obligated utilities. But I haven't really seen examples where that model is applied in retail choice states.
Got it. Some of our audience members missed your explanation for the reason why actual RPS exceeds required RPS in some cases.
Yeah, so I think maybe what that is referring to is that in some states with RPSs, utilities have procured more than just the minimum amount needed to meet their RPS. So they have surplus renewable supplies above and beyond what is needed to meet their current RPS. And so in some cases, they may be banking those surpluses in order to meet increasing targets in later years.
Got it. Thank you. And several states, including Massachusetts, for example, have had high compliance costs due to solar renewable energy credits. Will these costs decrease as solar renewable energy credits get phased out?
Yeah, yes, when and where and if they do, which I think in most, I think most states are phasing out SREC markets, partly just because I think they're understood to be, not sort of a sustainable over the long term as you get to, really high levels of solar penetration. And so, yes, I think the answer is yes, but as always, the devil's in the details, and it depends on kind of what you replace those SREC programs with, and what level of incentives are provided through those replacement successor programs.
Great. And what are your thoughts on the trend toward 100% RPS goals? Do you think that states will be able to meet these ambitious goals?
Oh gosh, I mean, I don't know. Other people's guess is as good as mine. I mean, I think certainly, states are moving in the right direction, but there are a lot of, major headwinds. I think, everybody is aware of challenges that exist in getting new projects interconnected and built. There are all sorts of supply chain constraints that the market is facing presently. And so, I think certainly, in some sense we know how to do it, but actually, getting stuff built is hard. And so a lot of our success will come down to how well we're able to overcome some of these logistical challenges.
Great. And we have some questions that are related to some slides specifically. So Sam, if you don't mind pulling up the slides, and for the first question, slide 6, we are wondering what's the meaning, if any, of the gradation in yellow on the map? Let's see here.
So there
6.
should, I know. So this is the CES map. So there isn't actually any variation in the yellow shading, but it's cross-hatched. So actually, Sam, if you flip to the previous slide, which shows just the RPS states, the shading there reflects the kind of the stringency of the RPS target level. And then on the next slide, we've overlaid kind of yellow to show which states have adopted 100% CESs. And so in between the yellow is the blue from the previous slide. And so the shading of the blue reflects the RPS target levels, but the yellow color is really the same from state to state. It may not come through very clearly though, I'm not sure.
Great, and then slide 13, Sam. So we have an audience member wondering whether you know why the share of retail off-takers, so buyers such as corporate PPAs and community solar, dipped in 2022 to 21% of capacity admission?
I don't. I mean, I would say, the market overall, I guess with the exception of on-site projects, contracted last year, and that, I think, is due to some kind of larger macro issues that I think many folks are aware of. So that I don't know. It may be that the kind of retail corporate community solar market was just maybe more susceptible or more exposed to some of those kind of inflationary and supply chain constraints that were kind of impacting the market overall. But I don't really know. I don't have a definitive answer, only a guess.
Got it. And then on slide 19, You mentioned that new interregional transmission may reduce new resource needs. What degree of reduction are we talking about here? Can you project even for the Midwest and the Mid-Atlantic region, as you mentioned?
I can't give a number. I guess, I mean, if you go actually to the next slide, there you can see for the Mid-Atlantic, you can have, some sense for just kind of the new supply needs there. And so the question is, how much of that, what looks like, 180 terawatt hours of additional renewable supply might potentially be served by, say, Midwestern wind. And that I don't know. I would guess that there's, at least that much existing Midwestern wind that currently isn't being used for RPS compliance. But how much of that, A, might be kind of physically unlocked by new transmission, and B, might be contractually unlocked given, where the RECs are ultimately are currently being used, that I don't know. And that I think is the more kind of labor intensive question that somebody would have to figure out.
Great. So I see that we are a minute over time. I have one quick clarifying question from an audience member, and then I'm going to pass it over to Sam to wrap us up. I think this person may have missed the difference between CES and RPS that you talked about in a moment. They're wondering, in an earlier slide, you mentioned nuclear and large hydro having a role, but just now in the Q&A, you mentioned that nuclear doesn't count. Can you re-clarify that for us?
Right. So, I mean, you've got kind of two different sets of policies here. RPS is where nuclear is not eligible, and then CES is where, in many cases, nuclear is eligible. And so, looking at sort of new supply needs required for CES targets, a decent share of that may very well come from existing nuclear plants. But there, we're really just talking about the CES programs. There are some other figures though where we're looking at kind of we're looking at non-hydro renewables specifically, and making comparisons between different things, and for that purpose nuclear is not included, but that's just kind of for keeping the comparisons simple and clean.
Got it. Thank you so much, Galen, again for this report and this presentation. I'm going to turn it over to Sam.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Galen. That was so great. Thank you, everyone who sent in lots of interesting questions. This was just excellent. If you'd like to join us tomorrow, we have another webinar coming up on Community Solar Plus Resilience Hub in Duluth, Minnesota. That should be a very interesting one. And then in early August, we have a webinar, Can Virtual Power Plants Replace Peaker Plants? A conversation with CEG and Rattle Group. So I won't answer that. I'll let you find out in August. So you can read more about those and register at cisa.org/webinars. And as we've said previously, we did record today's webinar. We'll send out a link to the recording and a link to the excellent report that was highlighted in our webinar. So thank you so much again, everyone, and we hope to see you at the next one. Bye, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.